Welcome back to section 8 of our adventure as we look at Queen Elizabeth. You might recall that when Queen Elizabeth was crowned as monarch in England, that she was the head of England, she was the head of France, which might be a bit surprising, and also the head of Ireland. English monarchs have been claiming France for a while, more out of a sense of formality, but that wasn't true in reality. Ireland was conquered by England in, it's kind of like the Ohio State University, these players that always tell where they're from on pro football games. Anyway, Ireland was conquered by the England in 1169 to 1171, roughly 400 years prior to where our story picks up here in section 8 of this volume. And English rule was in an area called the Pale. I did some research on this. The origin of the word really has to do with sticks, like wooden stakes. You think of Vlad the Impaler, and these wooden stakes were often used to make fences, which formed a boundary. Things inside that boundary were secure, they were stable, they were legitimate. Things outside that boundary, or things beyond the pale, which that fence line was sometimes called, were just kind of crazy, and society can break down beyond the pale, and that's exactly what seemed to happen in Ireland around this time. There were roughly 800,000 people living there, and Durant describes their existence for the most part as being full of misery and full of lawlessness. So society had broken down there pretty good. Elizabeth feared that a Catholic Ireland would be a threat to Protestant England. And throughout the history, England also feared that Ireland could be a staging ground for stronger European powers to launch an invasion on the homeland. So that's one reason that Ireland was strategically important to them. So because of this, Elizabeth engaged in a full enforcement of Protestantism on Ireland. Throw all the Catholic stuff out. Priests were driven underground. Masses no longer allowed. All that stuff. This resulted in a further breakdown of society. So it was already kind of bad to begin with, but now that you throw out what Will Durant called morality, which he says was really driven by religion and peace. When you threw those things out, then you get a society that is complete chaos. You get the murders and everything else that goes with it. Got to thinking about that. Religion and peace. If you throw those things out, then you get just this really base society to live in which only the strongest are going to survive. The religion part is internal. The peace, I think of that as being more circumstantial. I think of that as being more external. It's about your conditions. Maybe think about the Stanford prison experiment, and perhaps you've studied research on that. And it's a scary study because you see how quickly normal humans, modern humans, in today's society, normal functioning people can be broken down into far less functioning human beings, and it's scary. I think of the movie Trading Places, which perhaps you've seen. I think it was from the 80s, with Eddie Murphy, Dan Aykroyd. You got a homeless guy, and then you've got some Wall Street hedge fund manager or whatever he was, and it was arranged by these other guys in a firm to switch these people around. And they made a bet that if you just put the homeless guy into a situation in which everything's going for him, then he's going to emerge into a gentleman. And on the other hand, the hedge fund manager out on the street is going to start acting like a homeless person. So again, it's an internal versus external. The claim in that movie is that the external circumstances will end up shaping the person. If you move somebody from West Philadelphia into Bel Air, will they in fact become a Fresh Prince and stop spray painting graffiti and all that stuff? So anyway, there certainly was a spiraling downward in Irish society, but the extent that they had to do with the pushing of religion, at least a Catholic religion, underground, or whether it was just their whole order of life was turned upside down by what the English were doing, that's a question for further reflection. So anyway, the Irish, they're sick of what's going on. They're at their wits' end, and they appealed to Philip II of Spain, who of course is a Catholic ruler, and help does arrive in the form of Catholic missionaries that restores hope among many of the Irish who are suffering, but that hope also fuels rebellion, and here we go again, because the English will crack down on that. And really this chapter, the section 8, is a story of this repeated cycle of the Irish finally getting their organization together where they can fight against England, and then England suppresses them. And then it takes them a little while for them to rebuild, but that spirit is indomitable, and they come back and again get suppressed. And it's a vicious cycle that goes, at least in this chapter or this section, until 1603, which is about the time that Queen Elizabeth dies. So a couple key names. 1567, there's a guy named Shane O'Neill, who is one of the chieftains of a clan. Apparently, he had made some diplomatic inroads, even with Queen Elizabeth, but when he died in 1567, chaos exploded. Things went downhill again. There was a resulting massacre on the island of Rathlin in 1575, so just 8 years later. And there was a group of women, children, elderly that were guarded by some protectors and were sent there by the rebels to get them away from the scene of battle. And yet the English chose to just put them all to the sword, all 600 of them. The main revolt listed in this chapter was the revolt of the Geraldine clan in the section of Ireland called Munster. And the upshot of that was that by 1582, that land was just wasted. Not necessarily because of the war with England and all that happened, but they said that 30,000 people had died just in 1582 in that area, mainly because of the famine, but those who weren't killed by the famine were hung or killed in other means by the English. They said that the land in the years that followed was completely silent. You couldn't even hear a cow from Dingle to, let's see, what's the other reference? To some rock, some castle. Anyway, and that whole area was just complete desolation. Well, you think the Irish might have learned their lesson or just been too down on the mat to come back up, but nope, they made a comeback, and they made a comeback in 1593, and England eventually put down this rebellion as well, and that's when there was at least a time of peace around 1603 when Queen Elizabeth died. I want to read this other section. I compared Ireland to Cuba in terms of its geographical significance for the English, but this last paragraph on page 30 of this section reminds me of Vietnam for the United States. It says that Elizabeth's record in Ireland subtracted from her glory. And then this, she underestimated the difficulty of conquering in an almost roadless country a people whose love of their land and their faith was their only bond to life and decency. So, a little bit of Vietnam strategy thrown in there. So that is Ireland. And let's see, what do we do next time? Next time, we get to Elizabeth in Spain, and then we talk about Raleigh and Essex, which are two key people in her staff. And then we talk about the end of Queen Elizabeth. The magic fades, as Durant puts it. And that will conclude Chapter 1, dealing with the Great queen. After that, we're going to take off and talk about Merry England, as they phrase it. We're going to talk about what English life was at work, what it was like at school, virtue and vice, what life was like in the home. We're going to talk about music and art, and those are going to be more tangible topics that I think you'll find interesting as well. So we'll see you back here next time to talk about Elizabeth and Spain.